want to give everyone a warm welcome to this first day of Marxism Festival. My name's Hope. I'm going to be chairing this session today. I'm a member of the SWP in Birmingham. I'm going to introduce Amy Lever, who's the Joint National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party and also an author of the book Capitalism, or the pamphlet, Capitalism and the Politics of Food. Amy's going to be speaking today on that same title for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to have plenty of times for contributions, for people from the audience to come in and speak. And then after, Amy will come back and hopefully answer some of the questions that have been raised in the discussion. But I'm going to hand over to Amy now.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Hope. Welcome, everyone, to Marxism Festival. And one of the themes of Marxism this year is the multiple crises of capitalism. And I want to argue food is not separate from this. Capitalist agriculture and food production have contributed to the climate and wider ecological crisis that we face and have helped create the conditions that have given rise to pandemics and virus. But our food systems are not only a driver of crisis, they're also a victim of it. Food production itself is now being impacted by environmental and climate crisis, as well as by war, imperialism, and the economic and cost of living crises. And this combination is leading to food shortages, price increases, the wider questions of food security, and very crucially as part of that debate, even access to food. And I just think it is worth saying about all the discussions about food, we should always remember, actually enough food is being produced in the world to comfortably feed everyone, but a third of the world's population do suffer malnutrition and hunger because of lack of access. And this is not just in other countries, this is here in Britain. Food inflation has soared this year, it hit 19% a few months ago. And that means millions of people are struggling to buy food, they skip meals, relying on food banks, and then the food we actually do get to eat often makes us ill and unhealthy. They serve us up processed, ultra-processed foods. And of course, this is in a global food system dominated by vast multinationals, whether that's the supermarkets, the fast food giants, the massive food processors, the global traders. They rake in billions of pounds of profit while causing ecological destruction, malnutrition, illness and poverty. And so I guess that's the context in which I want to assess the future of food. Look at some of the problems we face today and what alternatives that there might be. So let's look at that food system that we're in right now. First thing to say, foods cannot be abstracted from the system of capitalism. The problems caused by the food system are directly linked to the way capitalism organises production in the interest of property for a tiny minority, rather than to feed people or provide healthy food choices. And the starting point to understand that is that food is a commodity, something to be bought and sold from which to make a profit just like everything else. And that means the growing, the making, the processing, the selling of food is very big business. In 2018, the global food system was valued at something like $10 trillion. So our food is actually in the hands of these massive corporations, and their aim is not to give us healthy food at affordable prices, but to maximise profits. And they're concerned about their bottom line and don't care about the impact on our health, the environment, workers or animals. And it means food, crucial to sustaining our lives, is not really being produced to meet our needs, but whether it makes us profit. And I say this because it's quite a new historical development. Because as capitalism came into being, it completely reshaped global food systems and the foods that we eat. Now, modern humans, we've been on the planet some 200,000 years. And for most of that time, we've had a direct relationship with the land to produce our food. First as hunter-gatherers, living hand-to-mouth off the land, and then as more settled agriculture developed through farming, growing crops, domesticating and rearing animals. Capitalism ripped up these ways of living and growing food. It destroyed the direct relationship that people had with the land and the source of food. Think about in Britain, people were forced off the land through the Acts of Enclosure, the Highland clearances. They drove people off what had been common land, forced into newly developing towns and cities to work in factories and mills. That meant they were no longer producing their own food. They had to buy food that had been grown and made elsewhere. And Britain's rulers didn't just do this in Britain, by the way. Colonial conquest meant they brutally drove indigenous peoples off their lands too, in Australia, in the Americas. And if you look at that process, colonial conquest together with slavery, this then really changes how food is produced globally. And just one example is a lot of the land that was grabbed in America and Australia was then used to rear sheep and cattle that was then exported back as meat to Britain to feed the workers in the cities. It is really striking how much food Britain was importing as far back as the late 1800s, actually. And all of this has a huge environmental impact. Marx and Engels, they're writing during the days of industrialisation, they talk of something called metabolic rift, that capitalism has opened up between humans and the natural environment. And they saw how people, they're forced off the land into towns. It meant that the nutrients in the form of food that are grown and produced in the countryside, or as I say, maybe even other countries, they get transported to the cities where workers live, but the nutrients are not returned to the agricultural land. They're dumped then in rivers and seas as waste. So if you've got this one-way flow of nutrients that's really detrimental to soil fertility. Actually, you might be surprised, Marx and Engels wrote loads about soil. We can discuss more if we want. But their analysis showed that how one of the central problems of capitalist agriculture that we face today, the erosion of soil fertility, existed from the start of capitalist development. And not only that, but from the start, there was terrible issues of the type of quality of food that then workers are being sold back. I mean, those in the food industry back then were seeking to boost their profits by adulterating foods, adding poisonous substances, chalk, mercury, and more to it. So the point here is there's never been an age of good capitalist food production. But then there is a big transformation in farming in the post-war period after the Second World War. It starts in the United States, and this leads to big changes in what foods are grown and how they're produced. This is really when we see the rise of industrialised agriculture and livestock rearing, reliant on hybrid crops, monocultures, fossil fuel inputs like pesticides and artificial fertilisers. And what we eat also dramatically changes in this period. This is when we see the rise of what's often called the Western diet, one that's high in saturated fat, salt, red meat, crucially refined grains and processed foods. And this post-war period is the time of the first supermarkets and fast food restaurants. I want to argue, again, we can come back to the discussion, that the food that we got offered was a consequence of this system. It wasn't actually a response to consumer choice and demand. Because very crucially at this point, in America, the state gives vast subsidies to farmers to grow corn and wheat and soya and rice. And they start to be able to make very big profits from growing these basic grains. They're actually at the heart of a lot of our food system, including processed foods as well. At the same time in this period, technological changes transform the possibilities for processing foods. It's very profitable to take some raw ingredients, do something to them, i.e. process them, sell them for more than the sum of their parts. I'm sure we're familiar with that. And there's a livestock revolution at this time as well. The subsidies also mean it's really profitable to grow grain for cattle feed and soybean and maize for chickens. And you combine that with mass production techniques for rearing animals as well, and you get vast numbers of animals brought together in warehouses, feedlots, reliant actually on antibiotics as well. And this helps create the cheap meat that underpins the newly emerging fast food industry. So we see really big profits being made from producing the basic grains and animals at the heart of the system. And, as an aside, the companies that grow in this period, these multinationals, they don't do a lot of the farming themselves, actually. I'd call them agribusiness. They make their money from the business of farming. They provide the inputs, like the fertilizers, the pesticides, they trade the grain, etc., really. As I say, this is also a time of the rise of processed foods, marketed extensively to us. It's the era of the takeoff of marketing in that way. And really, if you look at where we are today, processed and ultra-processed food, actually, which you might want to call it, with ingredients that actually bear little resemblance to original foodstuffs that you might think, they form the majority of our calories nowadays. A recent survey found in Britain, British children consume 65% of their daily intake of calories as ultra-processed foods. It's the highest level in Europe. So foods that are removed from their original real forms, chemically altered, all the processing destroys a lot of the flavour and texture, so it has to be added back in with, additives, gums, starches, whatever. And foods deliberately being designed to make us keep eating, combining, sugar, salt and fat in ways that create what they call bliss points to override our feeling of satiety. So we keep on eating and eating more. And a lot of research is built up to show just how detrimental to our health processed, ultra-processed food is, actually both to our physical and mental health. All these things we can discuss. But really, this is where we are today. This is our food system. Okay, now I want to turn to the recent shortages of salad and other vegetables. It shined a light really on the wider problems of our food system. Remember back in February, Britain was hit by shortages. Salad, vegetables, shelves were empty. They had to ration, I think, tomatoes, cucumbers and peppers. Now, some people blamed Brexit and then the increased bureaucracy, new cumbersome trade and customs rules needed to import food. I think it maybe added to the problem, but something more was going on. The shortages highlight these deeper issues with our food system, specifically being impacted by climate change, because the immediate causes were a cold spell in Spain and North Africa, combined actually with an increase in energy prices as well. So in winter, we rely on Spain, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt for the bulk of our salad imports. But the growing regions of Spain were hit by very cold weather, intense night frosts, crops in Morocco ruined by floods. So you have poor weather reducing harvests. Then they're made worse by blight and virus. Tomato plants were damaged and killed by disease. And then there's a problem of high energy costs. Because although most of our crops are coming from North Africa and Spain, some are grown actually in Britain and the Netherlands, but in vast greenhouses. Energy costs meant that it hit the producers. Their costs went up as well. And so the supermarkets were relying even more on Spain and North Africa. So you see this coming together, poor weather, high production costs, blight and virus, meaning that we had these shortages. And this wasn't just a one-off, an unfortunate combination of problems. In fact, it wasn't even unexpected. Farmers and growers of produce in Britain last summer were warning that there could be shortages due to drought and the high gas prices they were experiencing. I think the Soil Association last September said that all of the fruit and vegetable sector was in crisis and that growers were delaying planting salad crops because they wanted to save on energy costs. Yields were down on things like carrots, cabbages and potatoes due to drought in Britain last year. And I think that brings us to some of the longer term problems facing agriculture, not just in Britain, but globally due to climate change. Because the climate crisis is increasing the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. And that puts food production at risk. Blistering heat, stronger storms, droughts, floods, fires, changing rainfall patterns are all impacting in that way. I could go through so many examples, but just look at some of the examples. Key grains at the heart of the system, I've mentioned wheat, corn and rice, are very vulnerable. Last year in India, record temperatures damaged the wheat crop. The government banned wheat exports, which drove up prices even more, already, by the way, impacted by the war in Ukraine. Experts in the United States have said that almost everything they're growing and raising is facing climatic stress. Rice being left unplanted due to the drought conditions, surveys finding that maize crop yields could fall by a quarter just by 2030. Fruit and vegetables, I think something like 1 million, well more than that, millions of oranges were ripped off the trees in Florida last September when Hurricane Ian ripped through there. They had the smallest harvest since the 1940s. The drought in California has impacted on the global supply of processing tomatoes. Brazil, the world's largest coffee producing country, impacted by droughts leading to a 70% rise in prices. Dry weather in West Africa, impacting on where cacao can be grown, impacting on shortage of chocolate products. These are just some examples. There's loads more. And I think we can see how climate change then is a big driver of food shortages. And this is likely to continue into the future, changing what we can grow, how it can be grown, and maybe leading to more severe shortages. Now, just timing myself here, we should be clear, food production alone is definitely not the sole cause of climate change. The vast majority of carbon emissions come from burning fossil fuels. I think we're probably all familiar with the role of the giant energy, oil and gas companies that continue to extract and burn fossil fuels. But agriculture and livestock production are responsible for maybe about a quarter, maybe a third of total global emissions. And food production under capitalism is tremendously damaging to the environment in other ways, destroying wildlife, biodiversity, polluting water sources, obviously a massive contributor to tropical deforestation. As I've mentioned, the use of fertilizers and pesticides, driving really the extinction of animal and plant species, contributing to the biodiversity crisis. And I think these issues lead us to another key aspect of the industrialised model of food production, which is also impacting and exacerbating the problems caused by climate change. Because I talked about our diet changing, and actually our diet has undergone more changes in the last 150 years than in the previous 1 million years. And at the heart of this change is a loss of diversity. This is the big problem I want to come to. For most of our evolution as humans, we had a really varied diet. But today, actually, what we eat is really characterised by a very high level of uniformity and a lack of diversity. Just think, apparently, over time that we humans have been on Earth, we've eaten something like 6,000 plant species. Now, the world relies mostly on just 9. 3, rice, wheat and maize provide 50% of all the calories. You know, if you look at globally the picture. If you add in potato, barley, palm oil, soy and sugar, that makes 75% of all the calories that fuel our species today. So when we talk about losing biodiversity, we've lost diversity in our jungles, in our rainforests, our fields and farms, and on our plates as well. And, you know, this leads to the impacts that something like 1 million plant and animal species are threatened with extinction. But the problem is, diversity matters, right? For thousands of years, humans nurtured diversity because we needed it. Because actually, if you have a small number of very uniform crops, it means they're really vulnerable to catastrophes. They're at greater risk from disease, pests, and climate extremes. And again, this isn't a future problem. This is what's impacting and causing crop failure and a threat to some of our key foods. Because I talked about how in the post-war period, the production of key food staples, maize, wheat and rice are at the heart of this capitalist industrial agricultural drive that goes forward due to the vast subsidies by the US government. And it's at this point when we have the biggest loss of crop diversity, because hybrid seeds are introduced in the United States to produce a uniform crop for these mass production techniques. And this is also the time in the post-war period when something called the Green Revolution took place. Now, let's be clear, it was not called the Green Revolution because it was environmentally friendly, because it really wasn't. It was called this because it was a counter, deliberately almost by the US, to the red revolutions that were sweeping poorer countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America at the time. And what this revolution entailed was the process of spreading this highly industrialized model of agriculture from the US across the globe. So they started exporting the use of high-yielding hybrid seeds, combined with chemical fertilizers, the pesticides, the big machinery, to farmers in the global south. And as a result of this process, literally thousands of traditional and local varieties of crops, particularly wheat, maize and rice, were replaced by a very small number of what were seen as being super productive hybrids. So it leads to a 90% reduction in agrobiodiversity. And as I say, this reliance on applications of fertilizer and pesticides. Those impact on the environment, but this loss of diversity has other effects too. Because it's quite interesting, the name given to a genetically diverse crop in a specific area where seeds are kept and sown each year and passed down through generations, it's called a landrace. And as landrace wheats evolved historically, they evolved as mixed populations because this variation creates a lot of resilience in the crop. And there's, for example, there's an ancient type of wheat called cavalcha. It's actually from one of the first grasses, first domesticated by Neolithic farmers as they began to settle down. But if you took a single hectare of cavalcha, there could be something like 9 million individual plants. And that would create great genetic diversity. And it meant that landrace as a whole of wheat could adapt to longer term conditions and changes in climate and growing. And so over thousands of years, the landraces of wheat, maize, rice and maize and other cultivated grains, they evolve, they adapt to their local environment. You know, farmers, if they travelled, would usually take seeds with them, meaning that then those seeds would evolve in a new location, creating even more variety. And you can see as plants and animals move around the world, they adapt, they evolve, and it's almost like the storms, the soil, the climate, the altitude are folded into the genes of those plants. And that is how the world ended up with all these different varieties. And you can see this, I mean, you know, in the very different sizes and colours of different maises and wheats and rices. I mean, we don't actually often see them because we're given one, the yellow corn. But just to take maize, I mean, it comes in all different colours, red, blue, all sorts of colours, sizes and shapes. It's the same for all these crops. And as well as them looking different physically, they also have this hidden from view genetic diversity, which would allow them, it has a physiology, so they can resist disease, survive in cold temperatures, grow in deserts, or grow at a high altitude, or if they could tolerate saline soils or whatever it is. And there are seed vaults actually around the world which collect the seeds and store them. I think there's one, I think it's in Norway, and it gives a sense. It has over 200,000 unique samples of wheat, 170,000 samples of rice, 39,000 samples of maize. I mean, there's more than this. This isn't even all the types that have existed. But the point is, the new science of crop breeding that's central to the model after the Second World War, central to the Green Revolution, makes it possible to select against diversity rather than embrace it. And that led to monocultures of genetically identical plants. And that uniformity is really central to mass production, you know, a generic product, it's an industrialized model of farming. But this means those plants now don't have this diversity to resist disease or pests or climatic changes. And so examples, wheat crops have been hit by a blight and a new disease called wheat blast. And this reduced harvests in Brazil and Bolivia by 2/3. Then it was spread to Bangladesh through a shipment of grain. And as a result, in 2016, thousands of farmers actually were ordered to set fire to their fields of unharvested wheat in Bangladesh. Look at the banana. There's something actually like 1,500 varieties of banana. But the global trade is dominated by one, the Cavendish. That's what you'll be eating. This is a cloned fruit, actually. It's grown in vast monocultures. It's not resistant to disease. And what's interesting is the Cavendish took over from a previous banana called the Gros Michel. Well, I don't think you say it quite like that, but anyway, the Gros Michel, which had previously dominated banana production. And then in the 1950s, that was hit by a deadly fungal disease. And it, you know, became uneconomical to grow. But it's now almost like history is repeating itself, and the Cavendish is being hit by fungal disease, TR4. So you see how it's not only climate change, but the impact of the lack of diversity is very likely to lead to shortages in the future and leaves us more vulnerable. And of course, alongside climate change and disease and blight is that of virus and pandemic. The conditions of capitalist agriculture make it much more likely for viruses like COVID, but others like swine flu, bird flu, to cross from animals to humans. Partly, as I mentioned, industrialised animal production means large numbers of animals are brought together in single locations. And just as with crops, animal farming is dominated by monocultures. The animals are what you call hybrids. They're created and designed to give the best meat and a standardised product. There is no diversity. And that means that prevents resistance to disease and virus, because it means there's a very limited gene pool, if you like, which then restricts their immune responses to viruses as they mutate. So essentially, the immune fire breaks that may slow transmission of virus are removed because these are very not diverse animals. And, you know, add into that the crowded and stressed conditions that the animals live in, depress immune responses and make it even easier for the virus to spread. And you just combine that with agribusiness, as we've called it, spreading across the globe, displacing small-scale farmers, pushing ever into what we might call agricultural frontiers, you know, remote, previously wild, uncultivated areas. And that means that animals have lived in a lot of areas, actually, for thousands of years, but been isolated the pathogens that they might hold. But actually now, as we come into contact with them and move into their environments, it increases the risk of viruses jumping to humans. So you begin to see how this industrialised animal production and agribusiness create the conditions of disease and pandemic. Okay, so what are the solutions here? How are we going to safeguard the future supply of food? Well, I'm going to start with the problems with the solutions, if you like, because unfortunately, many of the solutions that are being touted to solve the food crisis are actually premised on the idea that more capitalist agriculture is required. In fact, many of those that have caused the problems in the first place, particularly this powerful agribusiness lobby, they use the excuse of climate change as a reason to adopt more industrial techniques. they argue that to help feed the world, because obviously they're so good, they need to continue their rollout of this industrialised model across the globe. So their solutions involve what is called climate smart agriculture. Climate smart is the new buzzword used by governments, corporations, the World Bank. This includes things like genetically modified seeds, stacked with different traits, so that plants will withstand floods or a warmer climate or whatever else. Particularly marketed in the global south and countries that are being impacted by climate change. You might not be surprised to learn Bill Gates is a very keen supporter. There's a lot of money to be made from this, and as there's a rollout of not only genetically modified but hybrid seeds, it locks farmers into buying the inputs, like the fertiliser and the pesticides. At the same time, companies like Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, I believe, they bought up those national seed banks, for example, in Malawi. So imagine all those seeds, the knowledge of generations of farmers, which is actually encapsulated in a seed. It's been bred for that area to work with the soil and climate right there, and therefore has the possibility of adapting to a changed environment. Those seeds are now privately owned by companies like Bayer or other agribusinesses. And alongside these so-called solutions is a push, you wouldn't believe it, for more artificial fertiliser use. Don't worry, apparently farmers can be helped to use it more efficiently through climate smart agriculture. But again, this is getting big subsidies from the US, the EU and others. So, you know, the fertiliser industry is booming. They're doing very well out of that. And there's lots of other examples of climate smart agriculture, from robotics, net zero dairy they call it, precision farming, drones, lots of examples. All of them claiming it will help farmers adapt. But often really they're a way of rebranding harmful farm practices, or they offer a way to cover them up. For example, it might not be a surprise to learn that JBS and Nestle, they're two of the world's largest meat and dairy groups, they were very excited to learn of an idea of changing cows' diets, and it would make their burps less gassy, it would reduce methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. But essentially, they were excited because it would allow them to just continue as they were. And the truth is, any of these climate smart agricultural products, they're emerging products, they're really expensive. They're not really affordable, they're only affordable to industrial scale, you know, cattle farmers, food companies or whatever, who want to increase meat and dairy consumption, not reduce it. So I would say they're false solutions. I'd also say that there's another thing that's going on. Big meat and dairy firms have got in to promote fake meats. They market them as a solution to the climate environmental crises. And I think it's a very cynical attempt, actually, of big food companies to make money out of people's genuine desire to maybe, you know, we could do something about this and change our diets. But not that that is a solution in itself, but people sometimes think it could be. And so you have a lot of hyped, you know, plant-based foods, you know, impossible foods beyond meat. The next thing that's being touted for the future is lab-grown meat. Seems very futuristic, doesn't it? You take a clump of cells from an animal without harming it, and then they're grown in a lab to create what is known as cultivated meat. Apparently, it's meant to be much more real tasting. I wouldn't know, I'm a vegetarian, but I don't think they offer a solution to either our food or climate crisis. Firstly, the aim of these products is not actually to displace meat eating. The companies that produce them, they want to sell more of everything. And what's interesting is these are a lot of the big actual meat companies, and they want to maximise profits, sell more of everything. That's how capitalism works. So they're happy to sell some plant-based foods alongside their meat products, especially if they can market it as helping the environment. And so, you know, and also they're continuing to you know, produce cheap meats. And why wouldn't they be? Because they're still being given immense subsidies to do so, because it's subsidies that still are going to all those grains that feed the animals at the heart of that system. I also want to say that a lot of these plant-based and lab-grown solutions, they can sound great, but in fact, actually, a lot of these new foods and these futuristic ideas, they are going to be used to make mass-produced, ultra-processed foods using industrial techniques. They're not going to increase the variety in our diet at all. Might even lead to less, to be honest, because they won't solve these wider questions of capitalist and unsustainable food production across the board. And in that way, it offers another false solution, because it provides a cover to carry on with destructive agricultural practices. You know, you think about it, climate change continues to ravage the planet, a loss of diversity means crops can't adapt. The solution is, oh, we'll have some more processed foods with these artificially grown proteins, which we're going to make money from in the hands of giant corporations. As I say, all false solutions and are really premised on a business as usual approach of more capitalism. So look, what are our solutions for a different future of food? First of all, we'd have to seriously tackle climate change. I mean, it seems obvious, but we do actually need to stop the planet warming any further, try and prevent a temperature increase over and above more than 1.5 degrees. That would mean absolutely stopping burning fossil fuels, leave coal, oil and gas in the ground, transition to renewables, increase energy efficiency. We should stop the rollout of industrialised agriculture and its use of harmful practices, reintroduce diversity and other techniques that are being used and developed that can build soil and adapt crops for different climates. And often these lower impact forms of farming don't receive any assistance at all. Many of them are steeped in indigenous knowledge. They work with nature and local conditions to produce food sustainably. But they don't get subsidised at all in the same way. So these solutions seem kind of obvious, but of course to do this would go against what's driving the system at the moment and those massive agricultural companies that dominate. And so I would argue actually we need a complete transformation of our food system. And that actually means also getting rid of the system of capitalism that drives it. And here I want to finish, if that's okay, just by saying that there are constant battles over food and food production. Food is a class issue. Working class people globally are given rubbish food to eat, as I've said, unhealthy and whatever. But actually, there are big battles, from the fight for peasant farmers to save seeds, to resist genetically modified crops, to the fight of Indian farmers, to stop more reforms to introduce the rollout of agribusiness, to those of food production workers going on strike over conditions in their factories or plants, the fights for healthier and more affordable school dinners. Actually, right now, a fight over food prices and even having access to food. These are big issues, and I think we should be part of those. We want to fight for better, healthier, more affordable food in the here and now, but I think we ultimately have to get rid of this system of capitalism that has created this rotten and destructive food system. I'll finish there.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Amy. What we're going to do is move to the discussion part of the session now. We're going to open with a little icebreaker, so if people would like to turn to the people next to them and have a chat for a couple of minutes, and then we'll bring people back to the front. Okay, comrades, bring it back in. Okay, thank you. I hope everybody has enjoyed the conversations in the group. We're going to bring it back to the front now, just to explain a little bit. If people raise their hands, I can call you in. People can speak for 3 minutes. At 2 minutes, I'll tap on the mic, and that means you have a 1 minute warning. And then at 3 minutes, we're going to ask you to stop speaking. Okay. And just to say again, people can make short contributions, long contributions, and Amy's going to come back at the end and try and sum up some of the discussion that we've had. So we've got a comrade in the back there, will be followed by the comrade here. The one in the blue shirt, sorry, my apologies. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to talk about, just briefly, about what Amy was saying about the absurdity of the capitalist solutions to this problem. I was talking to an American comrade just before this meeting who I hadn't seen for about 5 years. And I was asking him what it was like to be in New York. He lives in New York. What it's like to be in New York when the Canadian forests were burning, and people would have seen the pictures. And he said something that struck me as absolutely absurd. He said the answer from these people, the people who run the system, is that we need to cut down more trees so that there won't be forest fires. And it's a bit like what Amy's saying. It's a complete absurdity. There's no solution. There's no capitalist solution to this problem. There's no way of reforming the system to solve this problem. We have to overturn it and overthrow it. I mean, I'm reminded very briefly, reading as a kid when I was at school, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, where he points out about how the fruit growers and the fruit pickers are unemployed. They're kicked out because they can't sell their grapes at a profit, yet people are starving. Or in Woody Guthrie's song, Plane Wreck at Los Gatos, about immigrant labour being killed and growing fruit for sale. And that's what nearly 100 years ago. It's much worse now because of the things that have happened post-war. When I grew up, My grandfather, who was a fitter, used to grow vegetables in his own garden, and that was fairly common in the housing scheme where I grew up. That's all changed. People don't, I mean, I know, in what do they call them? People grow, but it's very minimum scale compared to what it used to be. We're the prisoners of an agri-business that we have to destroy, I think.
Okay, we've got the comrade in the stripy t-shirt over here, who will be followed by the comrade in the blue shirt down just below you.
All right, thank you. I think we need to be really, really angry about what's happening about food. We are totally dependent on it. We can't live without it. And yet there is a tiny group of people at the top of our society who are utterly unaccountable to anybody, who poison us on a daily basis. I mean, I worked as a young woman for a very short period for Rank Hovis McDougall in their development kitchen. And I am telling you, the stuff that we devised using all of the 6,000 or 60,000 additives known to man, they used to laugh at the people who would buy it. These packet mixes full of absolute shit. I mean, in reality. And every day they plan this. But not only that, I then thankfully became a school teacher. And you see what's happened to the food that our children eat. The fact that McDonald's is now the biggest provider of food for children across the world should terrify us about what these people are doing. But the Tories, when Margaret Thatcher was in power, she got rid of all the school standards for food in schools. She also got rid of domestic science cookery classes because she wanted children to do food technology. They also got rid of all the controls about what kind of shops could be around schools. And now you have estate agents like Foxtons using the chicken shack ratio to decide on house prices. Because our schools now, I could go on forever, but I won't, but you look at the poorest boroughs in London, Tower Hamlets and Newham, they have the most chicken shacks within walking distance of the schools. So, you know, the whole structure of our society is built on making a profit. That's what the Tories did when they deregularised. And actually, in a socialist society, this would be a central issue. We would have a commissar for food. We would have people in local communities discussing what people could make and how we would feed ourselves. I think it's a central question for all of us. It's not just about obesity. There's now evidence that shows that highly processed foods, ultra-processed foods, affect our mental health. There's some evidence in education saying it affects autism and ADHD and all those conditions that children are being punished for in schools at the present time. We need to, it's a key question for a different sort of world.
You've got the comrade over there in the blue shirt, and then another comrade in the blue shirt over there.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and great to be back at Marxism again. Absolutely great. I think it's all well and good to actually talk about food production and the crisis in food production, and obviously big problems. But you cannot actually talk about food production and that crisis without actually talking about the politics of famine as well. Because I believe that it's probably still the case, even with shortages of cucumbers and so on, that there is overproduction in some respects in some parts of the country, and food is actually deliberately wasted and destroyed rather than actually feeding people in poorer parts of the world who are in a perpetual state of famine. And I think it's really important to remember that, because food is important to us, of course it is, but it's also a method of control. And the actual profits that they're making and the way that they actually hold the prices by destruction of food is an absolute disgrace. And that's what capitalism is all about, isn't it? Profit, don't matter how many people die as a result of famine.
You've got comrade in the blue shirt, who will be followed by the comrade in the white shirt at the back.
Yeah, thank you, comrades. Thank you for the contributions. I thought that was a really fantastic talk. I want to come back on a little bit what Amy was talking about around, the material basis on which a society we live in really affects how food is produced, and I think it talked about how in the institution of a capitalist system, we see the disappearance or a ripping up of the direct relationship with the land. Which is controlled by a profit-seeking ruling class minority, and not only does it rip up our metabolic relationship with the land, but it centres the production of food on the maximisation of profits, as if food wasn't fundamental to our survival, and centres it away from human need. And as a result, not only has the quantity of food and the way that food produces completely destroyed, but also the quality of food has been massively destroyed. And you see this as well, as Amy talked about, with the spread of capitalism as a world system nestles itself in any corner it can find, especially through the process of colonialism. We see the institution of monoculture agriculture, which is a staple of colonialism and a staple of the capitalist system. And these have been instituted in places across the world where a diverse range of foods were always common, diverse ways of growing and producing and eating food were always common, and have now been reduced to, as Amy said, a couple of staple crops. And there's a really fantastic book by a writer called Walter Rodney, a Marxist, who wrote about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Not only did he talk about the way that colonialism affected people, but it also talked about how the institution of capitalism as a world system, not only did it rob people of their time and of their wages, but it robbed the soil, and that led to that leads to the massive increase in famines and food shortages that we see today, which were never a staple, never common before colonialism, before capitalism. And I want to finish by saying that the food system, it takes away the diversity of the food, but I believe it also takes away diversity of flavour. I don't know when the last time I had a good tomato was, to be honest. Never mind anything like that. And there was a famous revolutionary socialist, Rosa Luxemburg, who said that in this society we face either socialism or barbarism. And I think it was right, the comments that says, in a socialist society we can organise a way which the food production centres on human need and the need for food, not for profit and not for the interests of a tiny minority. But not only does that centre around how food is produced, but I believe that it will be a staple of a socialist society that we produce food that is, it tastes good and it satiates not only our needs to have nutrients, but the needs to eat actually good tasting food. And I think under capitalism we not only face a bleak future, but we face a bland future. So thank you.
Okay, we've got the comrade at the back there in the white shirt and the comrade at the front here. Just to say, there are loads of hands coming up. I won't be able to call all of you, but I will call you as many as possible.
I wanted to really ask a question and bring out the issue of migration due to climate change. I mean, is it surely it's a link, the tragic souls back from Pakistan who died in the deliberate tragedy brought on by the Greek government in the Aegean Sea it's not a coincidence that Pakistan had the worst floods in generations and generations. And I travelled many years ago in West Africa and the Sahel, and even at that time, let alone now, the effects of climate change mean that people are migrating because they can't live off the land anymore. And I also think we should say, they're welcome here, not just for people who are fleeing war and terror, but also, fleeing climate change, because I think a whole lot of those poor souls who are stuck in Libya and being exploited are there because they can't live in their own countries because of climate change brought on actually by the West and by capitalism. So there's that. I mean, actually, you can get wonderful foods. They're fantastic variety of foods. There's organic, there's every type of rice you can possibly get. You just have to go to those really posh middle-class shops and pay 4 times the price for it. So, it's all about what you can afford. I mean, I made a sort of change because I've suddenly been told by my partner that I shouldn't be eating a non-organic chicken. I went to a shop and bought it. It's 4 times the price, right? It's 4 times the price. So, I'm a sort of little basics man, but I'm slowly being sort of pushed into another corner if you can afford it. So I just think that's the issue. There's amazing food around, but can we afford it?
Comrade front here. You'll be very fit by the end of this. And then after will be the comrade here.
Thanks so much. I think what Amy talked about and kind of like the myth that like the food that we eat is driven by the idea of consumer choice is like a really interesting one, because actually the choices that we're given and like the diets that we now eat were like deliberately designed to be, to satisfy, to be the most profitable. Like now, like we eat chicken like all the time, right? But that wasn't the case like not that long ago. Do you know what I mean? It's extremely profitable to grow the grains that feed all kinds of livestock. We eat a lot more meat, as people have talked about. But people had to deliberately try and change our behavior in order to kind of satisfy this through, all kinds of things, advertising and the rest of it. So the idea that like things are being driven by consumer choice instead of like what like production and what the needs of those at the top is, I think is a really important point to underline. And I think just even in that, like just the massive like shortfall in actual choice that we have, like especially when you like take into consider people's lifestyles. Like people eat like something like 1 billion ready meals every year in Britain, for instance. And it's like, do people actually want to be eating these things, or are they so exhausted after like working in a shitty job all day, working long hours, having no help at home with kids, all the rest of it? Is this what people actually want to be eating, or these are the choices that we're given? And I think they don't even try and hide it anymore. Has anyone seen the ads for like Uber Eats, where it's just like, oh, everyone's tired, everyone's like can't be bothered cooking, life is shit. Like, why don't you just order some Uber Eats and you might feel happier for a second? Do you know what I mean? It's like they don't even try and like, advertising isn't trying to say like this will make you happy. It's like, no, your life is shit. So it's like, sorry, I should stop swearing so much. So I think it's just like this massive distortion of any idea of choice and control over any part of our lives. And I think I really agree with what people are saying about the system and about how it's all-consuming, and that requires an all-consuming solution. We need to change the system from top to bottom, and actually think like be able to have a conversation as a society and say like, how do we feed people that maximizes our health, maximizes the health of our planet? Because that is not taken into consideration in the way that we produce and eat and feed ourselves at the moment. That is not the principal consideration, even though it completely should be. Capitalism is an ecologically destructive system. It's actually damaging to our health. It's damaging, to our planet, and we need to get rid of it completely.
I've got the comrade over here. Will be followed by the comrade there. You there, yeah.
Thanks. Firstly, I wanted to encourage people to read Amy's brilliant pamphlet, which I'll be selling at the end of the meeting at the back of the room. But look, what I actually wanted to say is it's very easy to talk about the negatives of the food system and how terrible it is, particularly for the poorest in society. But we should also remember that food, because it is so intimate to us, because it means something to us, is also a site for struggle. I noticed on Twitter today that John McDonnell and a load of campaigners handed in a petition at Downing Street, 90,000 signatures calling for free school meals for children, something like every socialist would endorse. Why? Because there's an understanding that this goes to the heart of dealing with poverty and helping communities and helping people. It's not just about education. Think of the way that the question of food banks and the growth of food banks has become a symbol of hatred for the Tories, a sense that actually they caused this problem to us, and a sense of resistance. Think of the way when you go past a picket line, people are always bringing donuts, because actually there's a sense it's a nice thing to do. It really connects you because you're offering and bringing food and so on. And I think that if you read the history of struggles around food, what you come to see is the way that the food system is centred on how capitalism has distorted it and taken it away from it. Even people like Marx and Engels, in their letters, they write about having nice food and enjoying Christmas food, because actually for them it matters, and that is why also they see the battle over food, the adoration of food, and so on. There's something that workers and socialists have to be absolutely engaged in, and that's why it's not enough to simply say we have to change our diets. You know, I'm all in favour of the comrade switching from Lidl to Waitrose organic chicken, but actually it's not going to save the world, because this stuff is so intimately connected with how the system works. What's interesting as well is that it's a consequence not just of how they are today, but that historical destruction of society. The way that colonialism destroyed peasant agriculture, and imperialism continues to do that, not just destroying the food stuff and the variety that Amy talked about, but actually destroying all the knowledge that peasants have about how to use the land safely, ecologically friendly, sustainably, and all the things that go with that. And when you see mass struggles, when you see big rebellions and big revolutions, it's fascinating to see the way the food production becomes an intimate part of those. Think of every great revolution in history. The question of peasants and land ownership comes to the heart of it, because it's important not just for the peasants and food production, but also for workers who want to see safe, sustainable and healthy food. Think of the centrality of that to the peasants' role. Think of the way that how in the rebellions, workers' organisations have to take up questions of food distribution. How do you feed children? Think of the way that transforms. It takes it out of the family unit, out of the household, and makes it the property of communities and workplaces and so on. And that, I think, that offers us a future of a positive future, where we can, as socialists say, under socialism, it won't just be about us taking away the profit motive. We'll transform how we produce food, why we produce food, and how we feed people. We would even, I think, transform how we eat. And that's a vision, I think, that's remarkably positive in the face of such negativity.
Okay, we've got this comrade in the corner there, just about in the middle, long hair. No, in front of you there. Yeah. Sorry. And then after, we've got the comrade at the front here.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine, I'm from Islington SWP, and so confession, I'm a dietitian. This is my topic. I could go on about this. So I want to come back on quite a lot of points that people have talked about. So for example, Jan, talking about the chicken shacks there. That is what we'd absolutely 100% straight away talk as an obesogenic environment. This is stuff we learned in uni in our public health modules. So stuff that I've always really kept in the back of my mind and remembers that. And then actually where comrades are talking about their individual choices they're making. Fair play, you want to do that, that's absolutely fine. But we also want to talk about, the ultra-processed foods, because we know all about from the health point of view and so on. However, I always think when we talk about it, there's a risk that we're being moralistic, I want to say. And all of this comes into what other comrades have said. Let's say, for example, you're a shift worker, you've done 14-hour shift. You come back, you are absolutely knackered. There is no way you're going to make a fresh homemade meal for yourself right there. You're probably going to eat a ready meal. My partner does. Well, I would, to be fair, so why not? You know, when I've come back from work and I'm exhausted, I don't want to make a full-on meal. And I'm a dietitian. I am meant to be able to cook and meant to be able to do this stuff. It's not wrong. It's just, this is the society we live in. So we're not going to be able to actually get anywhere unless we're in a different society, unless we have a socialist society. And you know, we actually talk about that. And in terms of, say, food banks, for example, you see what's donated in food banks. Now, there'll be some food banks where they have access to fresher foods. However, that's not really the case in most places. If you're going to a food bank and you're getting, let's say, for example, a can of Spam in your parcel, you probably might not want it. You might do, fair play. You might not want it. But you're not really in a position to be able to say, actually, you know what, no, I'd really like actually that nice organic ham there. You can't. When you're desperate, food is food. Now, we talk about food being, so you're processed, you're ultra-processed. Let's say, for example, you have some peanuts. The peanuts themselves, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. Take them the next spectrum. So some peanut butter, relatively well done, still recognisable as what the actual product is. Then let's say some dry roasted peanuts, for example. Again, relatively recognisable, but still a bit more processed. Then you've got the ones that are those really crispy, like Thai sweet chili kind of ones that have those extra coatings. They are technically peanuts. You wouldn't really recognise them as that. And there's that whole thing there where if we're stripping back to basics, we can use that. We can use that to really actually help with our diet. So yeah, that's a little bit about that. Also, just for me to touch around hospital food. So where I used to work, I'm sorry, I'm just going to bang on to tell me when to shut up. Where I used to work in my hospital, we were so proud of our hospital food. So I used to work at the Royal Brompton. That's part of Guy's and St Thomas's, so one of the biggest trusts in the country. Now, at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, so we had lovely
please, comrade.
Guy's and St Thomas's, all mass produced. So many complaints about the food where we had to really protect our own food because we know we've made it in stock. We know what's gone into there compared to what's been outsourced for Mighty from et cetera, et cetera. I can't think of that. So this is about the importance of food and a moralistic point. So being mindful around that. Thank you.
We've got the comrade at the front here who, unfortunately, we've got loads and loads of hands. It's fantastic that lots of people want to speak, but unfortunately, I have been able to get you all in. But there is plenty of time over the course of the festival to do that. So I'll hand over to this comrade and then I'll bring Amy back in.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. Lovely. And I actually have a couple questions, but also similar to the previous comrade. I'm about to enter into the agricultural world. I worked on farms for a couple of years, but now I'm going into veterinary school. And so I'm interested in seeing, veterinarians. I feel like it's an interesting position that you can have as a public health ambassador, but then also coming from an animal's perspective and also biology and the medicine that's all tied into it. But it's such an intersectional field, especially working in agriculture. So I'm kind of curious if you would have any specific advice or maybe ways to frame how you interact with this system from working within it and also from outside of it, but also in a position of power. So I guess I'd be kind of interested if you have any advice for, framework or careers or things to think about. It's such a big world. And like I was talking with some people around us, there's so much intersectionality inherent in our food system that it can be kind of overwhelming to figure out where to start. And one of the points that you brought up about one of the ways that we can actually address the issues is reintroducing biodiversity. And I was kind of wondering if you could expand upon that a little bit more, if that's kind of in the sense of rewilding or if that's more looking at regional crops and focusing more on seasonality of food so then you can increase biodiversity that way. So maybe decreasing import-export. But it just sounded like, I don't know. There's so much you can go into it and I'm really excited to hear more. So anyway, thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Brilliant. And thank you to everyone who spoke, and apologies again for people that I didn't get to call in. Just to say that Amy is going to come back and try and sum up the discussion for about 10 minutes, but I have got a few announcements. Firstly, we've got lots of books here at the front, which are all available bookmarks, including System Change, Not Climate Change, which Amy has contributed to. Amy is also the author, as I mentioned at the start, of the pamphlet Capitalism and the Politics of Food, which Martin will be selling at the back of this meeting. And just to say that the opening rally kicks off tonight at 7 p.m. We'll be joined by Chris Smalls, who has a unionised Amazon in the US, campaign lawyer Arma Anwar, justice campaigner Marcia Rigg, and more. That's starting at 7 p.m. And just to say, before you head down there, if you have got any left luggage in the left luggage room, please get it before the opening rally, not after. But I'll hand over to Amy.
Great, thanks Hope. Thanks everyone for the discussion. I'm going to try and come back on some of the points. Apologies if I don't manage to get to everybody's. I think I want to start with what the comrade there in the stripy top said about being angry. We should be angry. As working class people, we are fed rubbish, and not only that, we're then blamed for it. We're blamed if we're not making the right food choices. And that's why I think it's absolutely right what you were saying. There should be no moralism in any debate that we have about food, because we're contextualising it in this brutal system of people trying to struggle to live in and making the best choices we possibly can in those circumstances. And that's right, we do want people to make the best choices, but we understand in that way. And I think when it comes to those choices, of course, lots of people might choose certain diets or whatever to have some impact, but I think we have to understand that that is not a strategy for the change we need to see. Now, as this reading, I've talked a lot about subsidies, you see, driving the changes in the post-war period, and they absolutely did. The comrade here who spoke about how this then changed what we eat and how that were marketed is right. The subsidies being used to grow these grains, as I say, soya, rice, particularly maize and wheat, much of this being used then for animal feed, this is right to use the example of chicken. Chicken flocks before the Second World War were about 70 birds in a flock. It was a backyard operation, as they called it in the US. Now there's units of over 1 million. It means far more chicken is being produced. It's really cheap to produce because they're getting these subsidies for the grain. So how do they make more chicken products? Food technology comes in and they market it, I don't know, the chicken popcorn, the chicken strips, the chicken whatever, marketed back at us. It's not from demand. It was given to us in that way. And this continues to drive many of the things. I mean, I just read something in The Guardian recently. 90% of global food subsidies, which is something like $540 billion, have been deemed harmful to the planet. So it's like, we can change what we're eating all we want, and they're still subsidising a really, really destructive way of producing our food and selling us the products. And then sometimes we have no choice but to have some of those things. So we're putting this in the context of this bigger picture of capitalism and understanding what that means in that way. And I think it's quite right. Someone talked actually about famine and about shortages, and absolutely. I mean, I think I said at the beginning, I think actually, if you looked at all the food that's been produced in the world, there's enough for every single person to have 3,000 calories. That's actually more than you need. But it doesn't get to you, can't access it. And there's massive amounts of waste. And again, they blame us. Have you wasted your food from your fridge? Have you chucked it away? No, I'm sorry, it's the supermarkets who have these cosmetic specifications to 1 millimetre of the blush of an apple that determines if it goes in the bin or if it goes on your shelf or not. Massive amounts of carrots discarded. During COVID, when they couldn't sell their potatoes in America, they didn't go and take them to people who probably needed them in their homes. Let's set up an alternative system of getting to food to people who can't leave. No, we dumped them in the ground. This is an ongoing process of how can they keep making profit out of our food at every single level. And some things were raised, sorry, I always like doing these meetings because I usually find out something I didn't know. So you probably raised something at the back about the Netherlands and other questions I wouldn't be familiar with directly. But I think it's interesting what you say about Ireland and a cull of animals, because then that is the way they deal with virus, isn't it? Pulling together vast group animals in feedlots, factories and whatever. Virus goes through, what do? We'll just kill them all. Massive destruction. It's a wrong way of producing animals in the first place, but you just think this is the way of dealing with things in that way. So look, people talk about, well, what are the solutions that we can go to? Actually, just before I come to that, I do want to pick up on what people are saying about that process of driving it out across the world, because I think that's really important to see that. And this is an ongoing process, and how big companies, a lot of food actually is produced on small family farms, particularly in the global south. And this is where agribusiness wants to get into. They do want the land, but they also want to lock those much smaller scale farmers into those global production networks where they are reliant on their inputs of pesticide and fertiliser, and then they'll change what they grow. A lot of those farms will probably grow kind of mixed crops, which are actually quite good for the soil, but you get them to grow particular things that can be sold on the world market. How do they do that? They've employed the most ruthless ways, helped by the states like America, but also the global institutions of capitalism, the World Bank, the IMF, all the WTO, literally forcing countries to open up their markets to the big grain traders who have been subsidised, so they produce grain really cheaply, and then they go and dump it in those countries, essentially, undercut the local farmers, take over the markets. Or they do it through trade deals. The NAFTA trade deal of 1994 forced Mexico, which is the centre of origin of maize, that's where it was first domesticated, it's where you can find all those varieties of corn, forced it to open up its trading, and so all the yellow corn, some of it just modified actually, in America that's been grown, could be dumped in Mexico. This then leads us to a massive rise in the processed foods that it goes into. Mexico has one of the highest obesity rates now in the world. You see this pattern of pushing it out through the institutions of capitalism, and then that affecting the people where they live. And that continues. And as I say, using the excuse that these poor farmers, they need the help of these big companies, actually a really colonial mindset from the Bill Gates and others of the world, to make sure that they can go into these countries and enforce these new climate smart technology and whatever else is on. You see, I think a lot of the solutions exist. You can read so much about it. People talking about the different introducing biodiversity. And there's a brilliant book there, is it up there? Eating to Extinction by Dan Saladino. It's quite well known actually, but that book is brilliant. I would recommend it because he goes around the world and he talks to individuals who are trying, he looks at where the sense of origin and where foods were domesticated, and individuals trying to reintroduce diversity. But you kind of feel like these individuals have got these answers, they're doing some really good stuff, but they're up against this whole system that's mitigated against them, but it shows the possibilities are there. And I think the central question that we have to ask ourselves is about control. You see, we need, as a class, control of the land, of the technology, of all the abilities that have been developed. We need control to produce food in our interests. And we want to work as a class in which, peasant farmers and Indian farmers and, food production workers are all our allies in this. Think, how do we use that knowledge that people have had for generations of producing food, but rather than going back to back-breaking work of peasant work, which is hard, how do you use the technology to make that better rather than against people? And that requires control. And that's why it's right that people are talking about revolutionary change. Because capitalism is a class system. We're talking about food being a class issue. They have control of that at the top, a tiny minority. We need to get that and collectively make decisions. And it's quite right when people talk about food inspiring battles at every level, and we should be part of them in local areas, for better school dinners or whatever. But on big scales, what was it that triggered the Egyptian revolution in 2011? In part, price rises in food in that area. Look at Sudan. Prices are going up. It can be central to change, and this is what we stand for, if you like, as Revolutionary Socialists in the Socialist Workers' Party. We are part of every single battle we can so that people today can make better food choices. We want the healthiest food for working class people now and for our kids not to be poisoned. But we also understand that to get complete change, we need control of that system, and that requires a revolution to get rid of those at the top, drawing on the power we have as a class because we produce all the food, we do the work, we deliver it, we grow it, we sell it in those ways. We have a collective power and we act together that can bring about that change. And I think this event, Marxism, is about how we get that change in that way, and we have to locate our food systems within it and be part of fighting for it. And so I would finish by saying, if you agree with what we've said and what we've talked about, we do want you to join us in the Socialist Workers' Party. It'd be part of making that difference and fighting for that big change that we're talking about.